The Great Commission begins wherever you are. Then it reaches to the ends of the earth. Some see a missionary's life as one of sacrifice. But one of my favorite missionaries, Jim Elliot, had a different perspective. He wrote, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain which he cannot lose." I'm reminded of the passage in Luke 24 that says, "If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it." Jim Elliot and his companions took those words with them when they traveled to take the gospel to the Huaorani tribespeople in the rainforests of Ecuador.
Between the Napo and Curare rivers in Ecuador, an area of about 7,000 square miles made the tribal area of the Huaorani. There were about 600 people total, making 3 smaller groups within the greater tribe. All 3 groups were equally hostile. The Gikataidi, the Baidi, and Waipaidi. The tribes were generally hunter-gatherers, and their weapons of choice were spears and blowguns. The Huaorani violently defended their territory, and any outsiders were deeply distrusted. It was generally believed that most outsiders were cannibal predators. They had already killed several Shell Oil employees in the 1940s, as well as many outsiders that trespassed on their lands. The violence was not only limited to outsiders, as they would have many intertribal skirmishes. Revenge killings were frequent, as well as raids on houses fueled by intense anger.
Jim Elliot first heard about the Huaorani in 1950 from another Ecuadorian missionary and quickly realized it was his calling to lead an outreach to the tribespeople. Elliot met up with Pete Fleming to take on this mission.
Fleming and Elliot traded notes on the potential ministry opportunities in Ecuador, and by 1952 were sailing for Guayaquil on mission with the Plymouth Brethren. For 6 months, they lived in Quito and learned Spanish. Then they moved on to a mission station deep in the jungles of Ecuador. They studied the culture and language of the locals. Elliot and Fleming would need more help to reach the tribe. In one journal entry, Elliot recorded his prayer for a team. "I have prayed for new men, fiery, reckless men, possessed of uncontrollably youthful passion, lit by the Spirit of God. I have prayed for new words, explosive, direct, simple words. I have prayed for new miracles. Lord, fill preachers and preaching with thy power. How long dare we go on without tears, without moral passions, hatred, and love? Not long, I pray, Lord Jesus, not long." Elliot's prayers were answered when Ed McCauley and Nate Saint joined the team. Elliot met McCauley while attending Wheaton College. Nate Saint, the team's pilot, served in the military during the Second World War and was trained to fly by the Army. Saint had already been shuttling supplies into other missionaries in the jungle. Also joining the team was Roger Udarian, who was already stationed in Ecuador for missions work. He worked with Nate Saint to provide important medical supplies. The first stage of Operation Aka was to locate the Huaorani by air. In September 1955, Saint, McCauley, Elliot, and missionary Johnny Keegan began periodic searches using the mission's plane. Locating a few clearings in the jungle, the team began to get hopeful. They found a sandbar in the middle of the Curare River that worked as a landing strip for the plane, and it was there that they first made contact with the Huaorani. They were elated to be able to attempt to share the love of Christ with this people group. They hoped that by regularly giving gifts to the Huaorani and attempting to communicate with them in their language, that they would be able to win them over as friends.
On October 6th, this month in history in 1955, they made the first contact with the tribes by dropping a package containing a kettle, buttons, and rock salt. The gift-giving continued during the following weeks, with the missionaries dropping machetes, ribbons, clothing, pots, and various trinkets. Jim Elliot and his group began making frequent flights over the land of the Huaorani in September 1955, dropping gifts from a plane. They eventually established a base camp along the sandbar on the Curare River.
It was difficult and risky to meet the dangerous Huaorani on the surface, so the team used their fixed-wing aircraft to drop gifts down on them from above. Nate Saint developed their drop technique, which involved flying tight circles around the drop zone while simultaneously lowering the package to the ground. He was able to do this in a vortex motion that had the effect of keeping the package perfectly center while in descent.
After several visits to the landing zone nicknamed Terminal City, they observed that the Huaorani seemed positive about receiving their gifts. So they decided to initiate verbal contact over the loudspeaker, shouting simple Huaorani phrases while encircling over their heads. Several drops later, the Huaorani began to tie gifts of their own for the missionaries as a gesture of thanks. They then developed plans to meet in person.
As the mission continued, Elliot would continue to journal about the team's plans and how God was always in control. He wrote, "The will of God is always a bigger thing than we bargained for. But we must believe that whatever it involves, it is good, acceptable, and perfect. I seek not a long life, but a full one, like you, Lord Jesus." On January 3rd, they successfully landed on Palm Beach and set up base camp. After the last delivery of supplies, he flew over a Huaorani settlement and, using a loudspeaker, invited the Huaorani to come visit the missionaries' camp. After the missionaries had spent several days of waiting around and shouting general Huaorani phrases into the jungle, the first Huaorani visitors arrived on January 6th. It was a young man and 2 women. The younger woman had come disobediently against the warning of her family. The man, Nankiwi, was romantically interested in her, so he followed. The older woman went along to ensure she was safe. The missionaries gave them many gifts, and after a time, the tribal people soon relaxed around the strange Americans. Nankiwi, whom the missionaries nicknamed George, was very interested in their aircraft, so Saint gave him a ride. They flew all around the jungle and even by Nankiwi's neighbors, where he leaned out of the plane waving and shouting at them. The plane stunt by Nankiwi was too much to ignore, and a group of Huaorani decided to make the trip to Palm Beach the next morning, January 7th. On the way there, they found Nankiwi and the girl without their escort. A senior member of the group, who had considerable experience with outsiders, gave his advice on how to handle the situation. He recommended they kill the foreigners. The older woman eventually returned and gave her account of the strangers' friendliness, but this was not enough to dissuade them, and they kept marching toward the Palm Beach.
On January 8th, after a few recon trips, the pilot Nate Saint located a group of Huaorani men headed toward Palm Beach and enthusiastically relayed the info to his wife over radio.
The Huaorani sent 3 women to the other side of the river as an attempt to divide the Americans before attacking. One tribesman, Dawa, stayed behind, hiding in the jungle brush. The other 2 revealed themselves, and 2 missionaries waded into the water to say hello. They were immediately attacked from behind by the girl's brother, Nampa. Elliot was the first missionary to be speared. The other missionary in the river, Fleming, before being speared, desperately reiterated friendly sayings and asked the Huaorani why they were killing them. While he pleaded for his life, the other 3 missionaries were being surrounded and speared by the other band of Huaorani warriors. Udarian rushed to the plane to use the radio, but he was speared as soon as he picked up the microphone. The Huaorani threw their bodies and their things into the river and tore the fabric from the aircraft. After returning to their village, they curiously burned it down, apparently expecting a revenge attack and wanting to fool them into thinking an attack had already been placed.
The men failing to communicate with their wives at the scheduled time caused them to worry, but the women kept it under wraps due to the secretive nature of the mission. A fellow missionary flew to the campsite to check on them and found the plane stripped of its fabric. He told the wives of the situation and that the men were not there.
The United States Air Rescue mobilized an aircraft, and in coordination with ground search, the first 2 bodies were found on Wednesday, January 11th. By the next day, all the bodies had been identified with the exception of Macaulay's. The locals returned his watch, claiming they found his body on the bank, but it had washed away. The identified bodies were buried in the same grave at Palm Beach on January 14th by the ground search party.
The deaths of the men were covered in Life magazine, including photographs taken just before their deaths. The worldwide publicity that followed gave much more visibility to mission organizations and access to resources. Jim Elliot's wife, Elisabeth Elliot, and one of the sisters, Rachel Saint, believed the men's sacrifice for the Huaorani people was similar to Christ's sacrifice for humanity. They both doubled down on their family's commitment to the people by remaining in Ecuador and working alongside the Huaorani tribe.
Leading several cross-tribe weddings, they were successful in ending the intertribal warfare among the groups and largely eliminated the rampant violence that plagued the people for so long. During his life, Jim Elliot longed for more people to become missionaries. In his death, however, he probably inspired more people to go to other countries to share the love of Jesus than he ever could have in his life. The resounding theme of October's Missions Month is the boundless love of Jesus in fulfilling the Great Commission. All of these missionaries gave their life for the gospel. Their stories will continue to echo throughout history.
During his life, Jim Elliot longed for more people to become missionaries. In his death, however, he probably inspired more people to go to other countries to share the love of Jesus than he ever could have in life.